Welcome to Ivory Secrets. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. We love seeing where our community is coming from. Now, let's get into today's story. The morning Rowan Hale signed the divorce papers. He was smiling. Not a nervous smile, not an apologetic one, the kind of smile a man wears when he's already decided the outcome and found the whole thing easier than expected. He set the pen down on the kitchen eye list, a small, satisfied exhale, and then he looked at her. Meredith didn't cry. That was the part he hadn't anticipated. She looked at the papers for a long moment. Her coffee had gone cold. Outside, the first snow of November was coming down over the bay, and the light through the kitchen window made everything look pale, washed out like the whole world had been diluted. She picked up the pen. She signed. "Is that all?" she asked. Rowan blinked. He had prepared for tears, maybe raised voices. Some version of the conversation they'd had 100 times, the one where she apologized and said she'd do better and he told her she never did. He had not prepared for this. "Meredith, I have a call at 8, she said, and set the pen down and left the room. They had been married for 9 years. 9 years is a long time, and it is also, depending on how you count it, almost no time at all. Meredith Calloway had met Rowan at 28, when she was finishing her doctorate in biochemistry at Dalhousie, and he was doing his MBA at Dal as well, and they'd collided in the way that only grad students collide, over bad coffee and a shared frustration about the photocopier on the 3rd floor of the library. He was charming, he was ambitious, he had a laugh that made whole rooms turn around. She fell in love with the laugh first, and with the ambition second, and she told herself those were enough. For a while they were. Rowan went into finance after graduation, climbed fast, landed at a mid-sized investment firm in Halifax, where he was good at what he did and knew it. Meredith took a research position at a pharmaceutical startup called Boreal Bio, a small operation out of Bedford with 12 employees and a shared parking lot with a dental supply company. They moved into a house in Armdale with a view of the Northwest Arm. Rowan's salary carried most of it. He mentioned this in ways that were subtle at first. "You work so hard," he used to say in those early years, and he meant it as affection. But somewhere in the years that followed, that sentence changed shape. "You work so hard" became "you're never here" became "you choose that lab over everything" became. Eventually, spoken in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning last October, "I don't think you've actually been present in this marriage for years." He wasn't entirely wrong. Meredith knew that. She had been distracted. She had missed dinners and forgotten anniversaries, and fallen asleep at her desk more nights than she slept in her own bed. She had been chasing something in that lab for so long that she sometimes forgot there was a life happening outside of it. She did not excuse herself for any of that, but she had also been trying to tell him what she was working on, and he had never once asked. Not once. In 9 years, she had learned somewhere around year 4 to stop bringing it up at dinner. His eyes would slide toward his phone. He'd make a sound that wasn't quite a response. If she got excited, genuinely excited, the way she did when something in the data moved, he'd say something like, "Babe, I have no idea what any of that means," with a tone that implied she shouldn't have said it at all. So she stopped. She kept it to herself. She drove out to Bedford at 6 in the morning, and she came home at 9 at night, and she sat across from Rowan at the kitchen island and talked about his day and the market, and whether they should repaint the front door. She stopped being a whole person at that table. She became the version of herself that fit. The thing about that, though, and this was something Meredith only understood much later, sitting alone in the small apartment she rented in the South End after the divorce was finalized. The thing is that you can only do that for so long before you start to disappear. You can only fold yourself down so many times before you forget what you looked like when you were standing straight. She'd forgotten, and she blamed herself for it, right up until the morning she stopped. The call Meredith mentioned at 8 o'clock that morning was not a regular call. She had not told Rowan that. She hadn't told anyone, really, except for her research partner Desmond and their legal team and Zach. The 3 people at Boreal Bio who had been with her from the beginning, Nkechi, who ran their clinical trials, who had never once complained about a 5 a.m. conference call, and old Hugh, who was 67 years old and had been doing pharmaceutical research for 40 years, and said, when he first looked at Meredith's data 3 years ago, "I've been waiting for someone to crack this." What Meredith had cracked, or rather, what her team had cracked under her direction, over 6 years of work, was a mechanism. She would not have described it in those terms to a general audience. The full explanation involved ion channels and protein folding, and a very specific class of rare neurodegenerative disease that most people had never heard of. The short version, the one she'd learned to give at dinner parties when she still went to dinner parties, was this: there are diseases that destroy the nervous system, and they do it in a particular way, and for decades, nobody had found a reliable way to interrupt that process before it became irreversible. Meredith's team had found a way to interrupt it. It had taken 6 years and 4 failed trials, and 1 year where the entire research direction had to be abandoned and restarted, and a period of about 8 months where Meredith came home every night feeling like she'd failed everyone who'd ever trusted her. It had also required a kind of obsessive, singular focus that did not leave a great deal of room for being a wife, or a friend, or a person who showed up to things. She had made peace with that trade-off. She was not sure it had been the right one, but she had made it. In September, 6 weeks before Rowan's Kitchen Island conversation, Meredith had submitted the breakthrough findings to a regulatory pre-review. In October, the response had been better than anything she'd allowed herself to imagine. And on the first Monday of November, the same week, Rowan had told her he wanted a divorce. Boreal Bio had received an expression of interest from a major pharmaceutical company in Toronto. Not an acquisition offer, an expression of interest. But the number attached to that expression, the number that their legal team had spent 2 weeks reviewing, the number that Desmond had called her about at 11 p.m. and could barely speak around, was not a small number. It was a number that would change things. Meredith had not told Rowan any of this, not out of strategy, not out of spite, simply because she had learned, a long time ago, that he wasn't interested. And now that it was finally, actually happening, she found she didn't want to be the one to explain it to him. So she signed the papers, she drank the cold coffee, she drove to Bedford in the snow, and she took the 8 o'clock call, and she sat across from Nkechi and Priyanka and old Hugh in a small conference room with bad lighting and a whiteboard that still had last Friday's notes on it. And she listened to the lawyer from the Toronto firm say words that none of them had expected to hear. So soon. She cried in her car afterward, not about Rowan, about the other thing. She let herself have that. The divorce was clean, as divorces go. Rowan had expected more negotiation. He'd retained a lawyer, a good one, the kind you call when you want things to move quickly, and had braced for a process there wasn't much of one. Meredith agreed to the division of shared assets without dispute. She didn't fight for the... She took her books and her research files and a lamp she'd had since her apartment in grad school, and she moved into a 2-bedroom on Inglis Street that she could see the harbor from, and she told exactly 3 people what had happened. Her mother, who said, "Oh, Mary," in a voice so careful it contained multitudes. Desmond, who said nothing for a while and then said, "Are you okay?" and meant it. And Nkechi, who brought her soup. That was the full extent of Meredith's personal processing of her 9-year marriage ending. She didn't have a breakdown. She didn't spiral. She went to work, and she came home, and she stood in the small kitchen of the Inglis Street apartment, looking out at the harbor lights, and some nights she felt a grief that she couldn't name, and other nights she felt something that might have been relief, and she let both of those things exist without needing to decide between them. She had a lot of practice at that, as it turned out. The acquisition announcement was made public on the second Tuesday in March. It had been a long 4 months. There were negotiations and counter-negotiations, legal reviews and structural discussions, and at least one period in January where the whole thing seemed to be falling through, and Meredith had driven home in an ice storm, telling herself it was okay, that the science was still the science regardless of what the business did with it. Priyanka had texted her at midnight that night. "We're okay, they just want more time. Go to sleep." She had not gone to sleep, but she had made tea and sat by the window and told herself the same over and over until it felt more true. The final number, when everything closed, was $430 million. It was not 800M. It was not a number that would appear on the front page of the Globe and Mail. Though it did appear, the following Thursday, in a brief item in the business section under the headline, Halifax biotech firm acquired in major neuro deal. It was, however, a number that represented the culmination of 6 years of work by a team of people who had believed in something when almost nobody else did, and a number that rewrote the future of a small company that had started out sharing a parking lot with a dental supply business. It was also a number that, due to the structure of Meredith's equity in Boreal Bio, had very specific implications for her personally. She did not think about Rowan when she found out. That came later. What she thought about first, standing in the same small conference room with the same bad lighting, was Hugh, old Hugh, who had been doing this for 40 years and had still believed. He was crying. A little. He was trying not to and failing, and she thought that was one of the most dignified things she had ever seen. She shook hands with people she'd been negotiating against for months and who now smiled at her like they were old friends. She answered questions from the legal team. She drove home in the early dark of a Nova Scotia March, and she called her mother and she said, "Mom, it went through." And her mother said, "I know, sweetheart, I've been waiting by the phone." Rowan found out the way most people found out, online. He saw the business section item. He read it twice. He sat in his office at the investment firm, where he had a corner desk and a view of the harbor and the kind of quiet authority that comes from a decade of being good at a particular thing. And he read it a third time. He did the math. He sat with the math for a long time. Then he called his lawyer. What followed was not pleasant. Meredith's legal team had, as it happened, been very thorough, had been thorough. Since well before any acquisition was confirmed, in fact, the equity structure, the timeline of the research, the specific terms of the November agreement with Boreal Bio, all of it had been carefully documented and legally verified long before the divorce was filed and long before it was finalized. Rowan's lawyer explained this to him. Rowan asked him to look again. His lawyer looked again and called back and explained it again more slowly. The short version was this. Meredith's equity was hers. It had always been hers. It had been established before the marriage, developed during the marriage through her own professional work. And the legal framework around it had been structured with exactly this kind of clarity. There was no ambiguity. There was no avenue. Rowan called Meredith. It was the first time they had spoken in 3 months. Her phone rang twice, and she looked at the screen, and she answered it. Not because she owed him anything, because she was not a person who avoided things, even the things she didn't want to deal with. "I saw the announcement," he said. "I know," she said. A silence. Outside her window, the harbor was doing what it did in March, gray and cold and indifferent, and also, depending on the light, extraordinarily beautiful. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said, and there was something in his voice that she recognized. Not anger, not exactly. Something more confused than that. Something that sat underneath the entitlement and looked for just a moment like the person she'd married. She thought about how to answer that. She had a few answers she could give. The honest one, the simple one, the kind one. She chose the honest one. "You never asked," she said. Another silence. Longer. "Meredith, I tried to tell you," she said, and she kept her voice even, because this was not a conversation she was going to get emotional in. "For years, Rowan, I would come home and I would try to tell you what we were working on, and you were never interested. I stopped bringing it up. You never noticed I'd stopped." She could hear him breathing. She could almost picture him at his desk, doing what he always did when he didn't have a good response, looking slightly to the left of whatever he was supposed to be looking at, recalibrating. "I didn't know. It was." "I know you didn't," she said. "You didn't ask." She let that sit. "I have to go," she said. "I have a call." She hung up. She stood by the window for a moment. The harbor light had shifted to something almost gold, the way it sometimes did late in the afternoon when the cloud cover broke. She watched it for a minute, then she went back to work. The following months were a kind of reorganization, not a dramatic one. Meredith was not a dramatic person. She didn't buy a sports car or move to a new city. She stayed in the apartment on Inglis Street, Because she liked the harbor view and she liked being walking distance from the waterfront. And she liked, frankly, that the space was entirely hers. The books, in the order she wanted them. The fridge stocked with what she actually ate. And the quiet that she'd forgotten she was allowed to have. She hired 2 new researchers for the team that was staying on post-acquisition. She helped with the transition. She was offered a position at the acquiring company and turned it down, politely, with a letter that her lawyer said was models of professional courtesy. She had ideas, and she wasn't finished yet, and the structure of the acquisition had given her the freedom and the funding to pursue them. She started running again. She hadn't run in 4 years. She went out in the mornings along the waterfront, early enough that the city was still mostly quiet, and she let herself just move without thinking about protein sequences or regulatory frameworks or what somebody's email tone meant. She had dinner with her mother on Sundays. She got better at cooking, not by a lot but enough. She went to Nkechi's kid's birthday party in June and stood in a backyard in Clayton Park surrounded by 8-year-olds and felt a kind of uncomplicated happiness that she hadn't felt in a very long time, and she let herself be surprised by that. There was a moment later that summer that she told Desmond about. They were having lunch at a place on the waterfront. Decent fish and chips, a table outside, the kind of August afternoon that makes you feel briefly that you live somewhere extraordinary. He asked how she was doing. He meant it the way he always meant things, which was genuinely, and with the patience to wait for an actual answer. She thought about the question. I keep waiting for the part where I feel like I missed something, she said. Like there's a version of this where I look back and I feel like I gave up something important, some version of the marriage that could have worked. Desmond looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Do you find it? No, she said. She said it without sadness. She said it the way you say something when you've been looking for it honestly and have come to a genuine conclusion. I loved him, she said. I think I really did. But I disappeared in that marriage. I made myself smaller and smaller, and I called it compromise, and it wasn't. She looked out at the harbor. I don't know if he did that to me or if I did it to myself. Probably both. Probably both, Desmond agreed. He never knew who I was, she said. Not really. I think that's the part I'm still sad about. Not losing him. Losing the 9 years of, she paused, finding it, of being someone he didn't know. Desmond nodded. Now I know exactly who I am, she said. I know what I can do. I know what I'm worth, not in money, I mean, though apparently that too. She smiled a little, because she was still capable of finding that part strange and a little funny. I know what I'm willing to give and what I'm not. I know where my lines are. You always knew, Desmond said. You just had to remember. She thought about that for a while after. Sitting on the waterfront, watching a container ship move slowly through the harbor. The afternoon light doing what it does on the Atlantic coast when summer is at its best, which is to say everything looks briefly like it was designed to be seen. She had always known. She had just, for a long time, let herself forget. In September, Boreal Bio's original research, the mechanism, the data, the trials, was formally published. It appeared in 2 of the most respected journals in the field. It came with Meredith's name at the top, and Nkechi's, and Priyanka's, and old Hugh's, and the names of everyone who had worked in that underfunded, improbably persistent lab in Bedford for the better part of a decade. The response in the scientific community was not modest. Meredith gave a talk in Vancouver that fall, and then a panel in Toronto, and then a keynote in Edinburgh, which she had never been to and which was cold and extraordinary and completely unexpected. She stood at the lectern in Edinburgh in a dark green dress she had bought the morning before the keynote, because she'd realized in the hotel that she'd forgotten to pack anything suitable. And she looked out at 300 scientists who had come specifically to hear about the work, and she thought about the kitchen in Armdale, and the cold coffee, and the question of whether that was all. Not with bitterness, more like curiosity. Like she was looking back at a map she'd already crossed and noticing, from a distance, how different the terrain had been from what she'd expected. She gave the talk. It went well. Afterward, in the hallway outside, a young woman, 24, maybe, Meredith's own height, dark, serious eyes, a lanyard from a university she didn't recognize, came up and said, a little nervously, "I'm in the second year of my PhD in your field." "I've been reading your work for 3 years," Meredith said. "What's research?" the young woman told her. It was good. It was genuinely, surprisingly good, and Meredith knew that immediately, the way you know things in your field when you've been doing them long enough. They stood in the hallway for 40 minutes. They exchanged contact information. That young woman, whose name was Kezia, later joined Meredith's lab. That was not in any announcement. That didn't appear in any business section. That was just a thing that happened in a hallway in Edinburgh, because Meredith Calloway had been standing there, in a dress she'd bought that morning, because she had not disappeared. Back in Halifax in November, exactly 1 year after the morning, with the papers and the cold coffee and the snow over the bay, Meredith sat in the apartment on Inglis Street and had a glass of wine and watched the harbor. She didn't make it a ceremony. She didn't think of it as a milestone. She was aware of the date only in the way you're aware of things that have become part of the texture of your life, a reference point, not a wound. She thought about Rowan, not with anger, without much of anything, really. She hoped he was fine, in the abstract way you hope for someone you once loved, but no longer need. She thought he probably was fine. He was good at being fine. She thought about the 9 years and all the dinners and all the conversations they'd had about his day, and all the conversations she hadn't had about hers. She thought about Hugh, who had retired that spring, and sent her a card from his cottage in Cape Breton that said, in his very particular handwriting, simply, "Worth every minute, kid." She thought about Kezia in the Edinburgh hallway. She thought about Priyanka, who had just been promoted. She thought about Nkechi's son, who had turned 9 and was apparently going through a phase of intense interest in volcanoes, which Meredith found extremely reasonable. She thought about the fact that she had run 4 kilometers that morning without stopping, which 6 months ago she could not have done. She thought about the research, the next phase, the questions still open, the mechanism that was proven, but whose applications were still being mapped. She thought about the work that was still ahead, which was, as far as she could tell, going to take years. Good years. Difficult years. The kind of years she was learning, slowly, to look forward to without apologizing for it. She poured a second glass of wine, which was one more than she usually allowed herself on a Tuesday. Outside, the harbor was dark, and the lights along the waterfront made their usual reflections, broken and remade by the water. The kind of view, she thought, that you had to be in the right state of mind to actually see, not just look at, see. She'd been in the wrong state of mind for a long time. She was, finally, not anymore. She raised her glass to no one in particular, to the harbor, or to the year, or to the work, or to herself. She wasn't entirely sure, and it didn't matter, and she let herself feel exactly what she felt, which was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, enough.